Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin the festivities for the evening. My name is Timothy Devinney. I'm the president and the co-organizer of this conference, who, along with my colleague Beth Rose, who's sitting here as well, we're going to do the opening of the conference, welcoming you all here. What I'd like to do is just make a few notices before everything gets started. One would be to mute your mobile phone. Don't turn it off, because your communication, if you want to ask questions, should occur through the app, as we've said before. But in addition, if you hear an alarm or something goes off, please follow the ushers so that you are exited out to the appropriate area. And that's about it for those kind of special needs associated with the conference. What I'd like to do is I'd like to begin by just simply noting that it's actually a great privilege for us, the entire conference team, to welcome the more than 500 participants from more than 40 countries to the 45th EIBA annual conference in Leeds. It's a significant amount of work that's been done putting this conference together, and it would be remiss of me and my colleagues to not recognize all of the efforts that are put together by many people to make everything work and in such an efficient manner. So what I'd like to do is to start by giving thanks to everyone who's made today possible, from the local conference team, which were mostly academics, as many of you know, to the 28 different track chairs who did an immense amount of work, to the nearly 450 reviewers who did the grunt work very quickly in reviewing the papers, and actually all the workers from Meet in Leeds, many of whom you will see with sashes guiding around lost academics and other individuals who need assistance at the conference. They've done a remarkable job, and I think the efficiency of what you're going to see over the next couple of days is due entirely to their efforts. Also, we would not be here in this fabulous venue without the support of the University of Leeds, who is represented here tonight by Sir Alan Langlands, the Vice Chancellor. The theme of this year's conference, What Now? International Business in a New World Order, addresses issues facing international business and international management in an era of socio-political turbulence, a topic that is particularly important to individuals living not just in the UK, as you would recognize through yesterday's election, but many countries that are facing unpredictable and unprecedented political change. It's particularly germane that this year's conference is coinciding with one of the most important UK elections in many years, and one which has ramifications not just for individuals within this country, but throughout the entire European region. In addition, we have events such as the impeachment proceedings in the United States, which is occurring only for the third time in the history of the country, and significant protest movements in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and South America. The EIBA 2019 Leeds Conference is aimed at fostering debate and discussion relating to the topic, and we've pulled together what we think is a fascinating series of tracks that, while loyal to the core topics of international business and international management, attempt to put more emphasis on the historic, socio-political, and institutional dimensions of these changes. In particular, we have a number of panels, not just the one that's starting in a few minutes, that will specifically be addressing these dimensions while also giving voice and viewpoints in research dealing with geopolitical and geosocial aspects of globalization, deglobalization, and political and social and environmental pressures. Our plenary session, held in this auspicious hall, brings together a variety of perspectives that are meant to open on the conference theme. Later in the conference, we'll hear from Professor Michael Storper at the Fellows Plenary on Sunday about the impact of economic geography on the structure of international business activities. The theme of the conference will be further emphasized in the panel launching the 15th volume of Progress in International Business series, which is entitled Progress in International Business Research in an Increasingly VUCA World. And this book is being published in honor of Peter J. Buckley, professor for many years at the University of Leeds. In addition, the conference program includes 95 sessions featuring competitive, papers, 27 sessions featuring interactive papers, 2 poster sessions with more than 100 posters, and 13 panel sessions covering a wide range of topics, along with a special EIBA history panel and a panel devoted to young scholars. Along with our colleagues and the entire EIBA Leeds 2019 team, we hope you find the conference intellectually engaging, as well as fun and productive, and enjoy what the City of Leeds has to offer. We also hope that you take the time to engage with all that EIBA and its membership have to provide, both now and in the future. With that, that's kind of my introduction, and what I'd like to do is to turn over the podium to Sir Alan Langlands, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Leeds. Prior to joining the university in 2013, Sir Alan was the CEO of the National Health Service. He was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Dundee, and he was the Chief Executive of the Higher Education Funding Council of England. He was knighted for his services to the NHS in 1998. With that, I'd like to welcome you to Leeds and to the conference and turn it over to Sir Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and welcome everyone. I'm getting rather used to this room because from now until next Friday, we have something like 28 graduation ceremonies going on here. So if you want to stick around, you could perhaps have a master's degree before you go home. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all, to give you your formal name, the European International Business Academy Conference, to welcome you to the University of Leeds and to the City of Leeds, a financially vibrant and compassionate city, and one that we all enjoy living and working in. Despite the weather, I hope that you will find a warm welcome here and the opportunity to consider the future of international business in a confused world order. And as Tim has said, this comes in the wake of the UK general election, and the country is now waiting patiently to find out if this will give us greater clarity or perhaps not. I've lived and worked through many elections, particularly in 1979, which was the beginning of the Thatcher era. And then in 1997, when Tony Blair was elected as Prime Minister. And on both of these occasions, I did have a sense that the tectonic plates had shifted a bit. On both occasions, new governments were elected with quite a clearly and carefully articulated agenda for social and economic reform. Now, some people today have been comparing this election of 2019 with these previous occasions, but it doesn't feel like that at all to me. The Johnson government, the Boris Johnson government elected today, arrives with a hefty majority, which is a bit of a surprise to a lot of us, but faces a really complex set of problems. Not least, the need to define the place of the UK in the world post-Brexit, and also, along the way, to heal the internal divisions that have arisen in this country over the last few years. The requirement for a considered approach to Brexit and subsequent trade negotiations, which builds business confidence and avoids too much damage to the economy. And then perhaps this is a bit parochial, to consider the future of Northern Ireland and Scotland, ensuring that as a country we continue to have strong local roots whilst being international in character and outlook. So this is a tough ask for any new government, but it needs to move quickly. In its previous manifestations, this government's been treading water for a very long time. So it needs to move quickly to be clear about how it will work with the business community and the financial institutions and how it will interact with other states. It needs to understand that given the much broader voter base that it has, that it also has other, I think, responsibilities, much more sharply focused than before, to encourage people and institutions to tackle important social questions of poverty reduction, economic growth and social cohesion. And it needs to move beyond what we're experiencing, not just in this country, but in many parts of the world, a kind of unsettling rhetoric of nationalism, and therefore, by doing so, play its part in tackling the global challenges of climate, health, security, and the big underpinning questions of equality and sustainability. None of these things are things that respect national borders. So this is where you come in, is how I see it. You come in here because you have to crystallize the issues facing international business and management. You have to undertake high quality, high impact interdisciplinary research that will cast light on these complex issues, not just here in the UK, but around the world, in every country represented here and beyond. And also you have a responsibility, as every university has, if you look at our logo on the front, interpret it later, to increase knowledge and to prepare the professionals, the critical thinkers, the problem solvers of the future, young people who are ready to compete in the global employment market and to make a difference in this complex and slightly confused world. So here you are at the University of Leeds. Leeds is a top 100 university in the world, a top 10 university in the UK for research power and impact. We have a very strong commitment, and most people would say this, wouldn't they, in a university, but a very strong commitment to high standards of education, a great student experience, we believe, and we've also had huge research successes recently. Success in the Global Challenges Research Fund with 170 projects in 40 countries, many of them in the Global South. Success as a lead partner in key national institutes, the Turing Institute with its focus on data science and artificial intelligence, the Franklin Institute, which works at the boundary between physical sciences and biological sciences, and the Royce Institute of Material Science. These are now big headline institutions in the UK, and Leeds and other universities working together to ensure their success. We're also supporting the government much more than we have done in the past in pursuing the industrial strategy of the country, which I'm sure is about to be redefined and hopefully made a bit more ambitious than it's been so far. Through what is known here as the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And hugely successful in terms of encouraging the next generation. The university has been very successful in the national competitions for doctoral training and early career fellowships. And this notion of developing in every major research-intensive university, not just in this country, but around the world, really vibrant PhD and postdoc communities, I think, is essential to our future. We're also very proud here of the Leeds University Business School, represented in this room and, of course, part of this great organisation. The business school here is a faculty in its own right. It has a seat at the top table of the university. It's a world ranking, triple accredited school, as many of you will know, and we're currently investing £75 million in the school over the next 2 or 3 years to support expansion, but almost more importantly, to support even higher standards of education and research, and an approach to interdisciplinary working which takes full advantage of the breadth and depth of the whole university, and indeed our industrial partners and other partners beyond the walls of the university. So you are all very welcome here. I hope that you have an enjoyable time in Leeds. I hope that you have a fulfilling conference, and it's a pleasure to have you in the UK, for those of you who've come from overseas, and a pleasure in particular to have you in Leeds. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening. My name is Beth Rose, and I've been Tim's understudy for the past year. I've been joking with people that we're about to welcome 500 or so of my closest friends to Leeds, and standing back there as you all came in, I realized, well, it's not as far off as I was joking. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're really, really pleased to have you here. Tim mentioned some thanks. I would very much like to recognize the amazing amount of effort that Tim has put into this over the past year. So thank you, Tim. And yay. And the other person who's been doing this on top of her day job is Vicki Weeks. Is Vicki here? So you've all heard, there's Vicki. So thank you, Vicki. Monday, you get to sleep. Yay! Okay, it's my happy duty to invite our speakers up. Sorry, I didn't think of that. I always have. So you guys get comfy chairs. We have a terrific plenary, opening plenary, and it's my wonderful opportunity to introduce you to our speakers. While they're getting settled, when I call your name, just wave, okay? Will Hutton. Hi. Will's been stuck in traffic, so we haven't met yet. Anyway, Will has a fascinating career, and I think that's one thing that ties all three of our speakers together. He's been a stockbroker. He's got an MBA from INSEAD. He's spent 10 years with the BBC working as an economics correspondent. He spent 4 years as editor-in-chief of The Observer and director of the Guardian national newspapers before joining the Industrial Society, which is now known as the Work Foundation, as chief executive in 2000. He's a columnist, an author, and chief executive. He's governor of London School of Economics, visiting professor at several different places. I don't think he sleeps. I think you'll find that's kind of common among the four of these people. In 2011, he was appointed as principal of Hertford College in Oxford, and he sits on the European Advisory Board of Princeton University Press. Sorry, anytime I can get Princeton into the conversation, I do. So, welcome. Geoffrey Jones. Jeff is the Isidor Straus Professor of Business History at the Harvard Business School. Sorry. I went to Princeton. I can't keep saying Harvard. And he holds several degrees from Cambridge University and honorary doctorates from Copenhagen Business School and the University of Helsinki. He's taught several different places, has held visiting professorships in a wide variety of countries. I thought I traveled a lot, but I think Jeff has me beat. He serves on committees related to African studies, Japanese studies, and Latin American studies, which I find quite fascinating. His work, which is always extremely interesting, focuses on historical evolution of globalization, international banking and trading, and foreign direct investment by multinational firms. He's a prolific author, an EIBA fellow, and he's flown in just for this, so Jeff, welcome. And Victor Mallet is a journalist, editor, commentator, and author with, whoa, what did I do? Sorry. Yeah, that must have been it. Or I kind of like the word journalist better. He's got more than 3 decades of experience in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. He's currently the Paris bureau chief of the Financial Times, and he's previously held posts in Delhi, in Madrid, in Hong Kong, and previously as a correspondent in Paris. He's also won lots of awards. He's twice won the Society of Publishers in Asia Award for opinion writing. And in India, he's twice been awarded the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism as a foreign correspondent. His latest book is called River of Life, River of Death, the Ganges and India's Future. And I'm looking forward to reading that. So welcome, Victor. And Eleanor. Eleanor Westney is going to moderate the discussion, so she has to keep these three in line. Good luck. She is the Sloan Fellows Professor of Strategy and International Management Emerita at MIT Sloan School of Management. She spent most of her career at MIT, and most recently was at the Schulich School of Business at York University, so she's actually emerita from two places. She did her undergrad and master's in sociology and Japanese studies at the University of Toronto and received her PhD in sociology from Princeton. We were actually there at the same time, but she's heaps smarter than I am. So I got a bachelor's, she got a PhD. Yeah, real close. Anyway, she's always done amazing work on looking at things like patterns of cross-border organizational learning, and has always brought a sociological perspective to IB that's extremely welcome. She's had visiting appointments at Hitotsubashi University and the University of Tokyo in Japan, the University of Michigan, and she's a fellow of the Academy of International Business. Sorry. And a previous chair of the International Management Division of the Academy of Management, and she's been a dean of the AIB Fellows, and she's one of my most wonderful friends. So welcome. Now, one thing, guys, this is not strictly something where you sit there. If you have questions to put to our illustrious panel and moderator, you can use the app.
Ah.
For those of you who don't want to use the app, or who find it confusing somewhat like me, I'm slightly Luddite, you can write something on paper, and Tim and Zico and Stephen will be roaming around and will pass those up to me so we can get questions to our panel. So you're here to listen to them, not me. Eleanor, take it away.
Yes, so I think each one gets to make an opening presentation, and who wants to start? Will, you were first to be introduced.
Still writing it. Now, how long do you want to talk? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
10 minutes would be
10 minutes.
grand.
Well, I've got some notes here. So you want to go to the podium, or do you want to sit down?
You can take your choice if
How
you
would
find
the
it easy.
audience? I mean, would you like to stand up there or sit down? How would you like us? Standing up, sitting down. Go on. All right.
As usual in this divided world, you get divided counsels.
Yeah.
So you ask the people, and then you make your decision.
Okay. Let me just say a few remarks about how I view European and US capitalism as they kind of sit in this third decade of the 21st century. I should say that I co-chair what the FT described as an influential think tank called the Purposeful Company. And we've been going for 4 years with the support of the Bank of England, and actually long before, well, 4 years before, the Financial Times launched their current campaign, Time for a Reset. We need to put purpose alongside profit in the way we conduct contemporary capitalism. That was the leitmotif of this small think tank I chair. And I guess that I've been very influenced recently, and I'm sure some of you may have already come across this book, The Great Reversal by Thomas Philippon, leading French economist who's an advisor to the New York Fed, and also as a professor at kind of Stern Business School at NYU. Just to set the scene a bit, a kind of 3 or 4 sentences preamble, then cut to the chase. I mean, everyone's aware that we now have a majority Johnson government, purporting to be a one-nation government. And everyone has observed that the Conservative Party have won seats, but particularly actually in the Yorkshire coalfield, that would have been deemed unwinnable and have been in the Labour control for decades. And the bien-pensant view, and I kind of subscribe to it, is that the operation of contemporary capitalism has not only thrown up wealth and income inequalities, but also spatial inequalities. And they're very obvious in Yorkshire. A town like Leeds, or a city like Leeds with its universities, and its powerful medical school and its powerful kind of legal community. I know people who think the Supreme Court should be located to Leeds as part of federalizing the United Kingdom, is where that burgeoning jobs and opportunity kind of in the knowledge industries associated with high tech, AI, et cetera, Meanwhile, the smaller towns, the satellite towns, the old coal mining and industrial towns are actually very substantially left behind. And they voted for the Conservative Party in droves yesterday. And we're all assimilating that news. And any discussion about contemporary capitalism kind of needs to think about the way not only is it throwing up substantive income and wealth inequalities, but spatial inequalities. And those are true all around the European Union. Anyone who knows Italy well will compare and contrast Milan with some of the the old industrial town districts along the Po Valley that used to be kind of admired for their vigor, now are actually turning quasi-fascist for the first time since the war. Similar tensions in Spain, where there's been 3 general elections in a year. In Germany, we know the story with Alternative for Deutschland and the near collapse of the Grand Coalition, and so it is around Europe, and everyone knows the story in the United States. So an open question is kind of how, if we're talking about kind of contemporary capitalism and to an academic audience, I mean, I think there's kind of for me a number of substantive questions. One is actually how are companies owned? What is their North Star? To what extent is contemporary capitalism gone rogue? There's a second question, which is even if it's not going rogue, how do you deal with what is a policy response to these colossal spatial inequalities and the cultural kind of difficulties that flow from them, where mutual suspicion between the kind of liberal kind of metropolitan elite of which you are fully paid up members in this audience, and working people who feel that actually the kinds of job that gave them kind of a reason to live well, to deliver a career, to actually, in their own way, to kind of live out the Aristotelian question, which is, what is it that makes a human being happy? Is it material and well-being? Is it love? Or is it, as Aristotle kind of posed, and which I actually buy into, that actually it is in some small incremental way that you use the kind of your endowment of skills and energy on the world to make it better. And actually, if you're sitting in the constituencies that actually shocked us last night by voting Tory, people of Blythe Valley or Bishop Auckland or and all those places, Stoke Central, that voted Conservative, they're saying loud and clear, this system doesn't work for us. And they're saying the same kind of in those Midwestern flyover states who will probably vote for President Trump in substantive numbers in November 2020. Now, one of the things that I am struck by, and there's another question which actually the Philippon book raises, and it is that that actually American capitalism, held up as kind of the benchmark by which we should all judge our capitalisms, it is more flexible, it is more dynamic, etc., has actually, over the last 20 years, become highly silted up. And he comes up with some extraordinary numbers which are counterintuitive. For example, per capita income growth over the last 20 years is kind of 21% in the United States, 19% in China, 25% in the European Union. Now, if you absent Italy from that figure, which is a very, very particular European country, the figure, and have had flat per capita income growth for 2 decades, the figure is near 30 in the EU. And this is a very, very substantive divergence, and actually not the kind of conventional wisdom where we all know that Europe is sclerotic, one should leave it, one should tie our hands as a national community in Britain to the dynamic Americans, we should leave behind Brussels and all its works. Actually, Philippon argues, says, hold on a second, just look at broadband prices. Broadly, per month, kind of $68 in the United States, 29 in Italy, 37 in France, and Germany and Japan. Cell phones cost $100 a month for your kind of rental. And in France and Germany, the figure is half that. Profit per passenger mile in the airline industry, twice that in the United States, compared with the EU. And the point he's making is that American capital has become profoundly concentrated, profoundly monopolistic, extraordinarily rent-seeking. That has thrown up these extraordinary inequalities. It's one of the reasons why real wages have stagnated or gone down. That itself is one of the reasons why the United States suffers its epidemic of what doctors call shit life syndrome and the opioid crisis. There's a whole nexus of issues. The kill and the crib strategy from the high-tech giants. The whole damn thing is a capitalism that is dysfunctional. Why? Because it costs 50 times more to buy a vote in America than in Europe. And the quid pro quo by American regulators and legislators is actually to protect kind of bad behaviors in the United States against extraordinarily a kind of much more vigorous approach in Europe. Essentially, I mean, I was not time, but we could discuss the way Boeing bought the Federal Aviation Authority's kind of allowing the Mark 8 737 to fly, now actually reasserting their independence by saying it can only fly next year at the earliest. Boeing bought that. That was a result of lobbying and a result of the way the US system operates, and has actually proved to be extraordinarily counterproductive kind of to Boeing's reputation and actually kind of share price. So, I mean, the EU, more to be said, I can take it in Q&A. What Philippon argues is that it is the regulators are more independent, the capitalism is paradoxically more rigorous, that there are more kind of insurgent startups. You'd be surprised about that. I would argue, coming back to my opening remarks in 3 more sentences and I'll stop, that the American Business Roundtable made famously at the end of August its statement that shareholder value maximization was no longer the point. The point was kind of societal benefit and trading of all the benefits of stakeholders. The European Business Roundtable has been saying that for the last 25 years. So, I mean, the academic challenge is, and one of the things that we're trying to do in the personal company, is to demonstrate that corporations driven by purpose around European conceptions, and some in America, and with a shelter base to do it, outperform over a period, providing the wider ecosystem is right along kind of things that Philippon outlined, than comparable capitalisms, of which the US, interestingly, kind of is the most degenerate. So there you are. More to be, just to kick you off the provocation. Thank you. I'm sorry to take it a little longer.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So Jeff, do you want to take it next?
Well, I think I should, as I teach at the West Point of this degenerate capitalism. Probably utter a few words. Actually, I wanted to take, as you might have predicted, a slightly different tack, but one that has quite a lot of parallels with what Will was saying. I want to use my 10 minutes of fame to ponder why the faculty of business schools, including IB faculty, have contributed so little to predicting the current turbulence in the world environment, understanding it, or suggesting paths out of it. I thought about this quite a bit. I thought one issue is clearly the problems of fake news, problems of misaligned incentives associated with clickbaits. All of that is very bad. But I think also the voices have also been very quiet. I mean, this is very odd, I think, because business is quite clearly at the root of most of the problems we're currently dealing with. It's at the root of inequality, it's at the root of ecological meltdown, and it's at the root of numerous policy distortions caused by corporate lobbying. If you look at business school disciplines, some disciplines like finance have massively contributed to those problems by the development of toxic instruments. And that certainly goes to my colleagues in my finance unit. Other disciplines have simply been pretty much silent about these problems. And I think that goes for international business, which is odd, because international business is at its core associated with deals with globalization or whatever. So why is that? I mean, and I have several explanations. I think at a time like this, the downsides of our present academic ecostructure are extremely severe. So, as I think we all know, top journals and appointment and promotions committees very rarely award people who think out of the box. Although the Vice-Chancellor praised interdisciplinary research at Leeds, in most institutions, including my own, interdisciplinary research is the kiss of death if you want to be promoted. In all social sciences, the focus on demonstrating causality forces scholars to address issues only when there is robust statistical data which can be explored and tested. That, as a result, confines what can be explored, and it confines the settings. I think every discipline has a number of unspoken assumptions. International business has a number of unspoken assumptions, which I think are running into trouble. The first is all of the theory and most research questions were formulated since the 1960s when global business was steadily increasing. Questions there tend to be more about like entry than about exit. Unfortunately, this world is going away. The second assumption, I think, is that multinationals are at heart always beneficial. This is absolutely not true historically, and everybody knows that. The third assumption is that decisions are driven by economic rationality. A question of populism here comes up. Some drivers of populism, I think, are clearly driven by economic rationality, the problems of inequality and of unemployment. However, as half the political science colleagues would say, cultural backlash is also a huge driver. That's less explicable by understanding rationality. And if you look at the United States, sure, the flyover states have got horrible problems, but the United States also has problems related to race and related to religion, which are unrelated to driving, explaining what's going on with Donald Trump. What to do about that? Well, that's a good question. I would suggest all academic disciplines, including international business, need greater contextual intelligence. Openness to other disciplines is the start of that. I have a vested interest, as you can imagine, in saying openness to history is important at all sorts of levels. Openness to history lets us look at how the world has globalized before and has deglobalized, famously in the interwar years. More importantly, though, it encourages us to think what the term deglobalization means. In the interwar years, you've got falls in capital, trade, and migration flows, pretty much like we have now. But international business didn't go away. It changed modes, it changed behavior. You've got regional blocks. Deglobalization is not literally deglobalization. I would say that the same thing is happening now. For sure, trade and investment flows are falling, less manufacturing goods are being moved around, but then services have replaced goods anyway. So instead of lots of disk drives being shipped around to store data, we now have the cloud. All sorts of different things are being globalized. Instant ramen is everywhere. Soccer teams in England's Premier League are watched around the globe. We have a lot of things going on in the current world. IB is not well positioned to study those because it's excessively focused on manufacturing industry. And it needs to be somewhere, it needs to be someone else. At another level, and I'm going to stop soon, history enables us to get serious about the impact of multinationals. It's obvious from history that multinationals encourage inequality rather than reduce it. That's what they do, because of, for reasons we can talk about. From a broad perspective, it's clear that a lot of countries that avoided close engagement with global business have done better than countries that engaged with it. And I think, for example, of post-war Japan, post-war South Korea, where you have a very constrained openness to global business and enabled those countries to build capacities that other countries didn't. And multinationals have been very bad actors. If you wonder why China can now control the web, you can say, thank you very much, Cisco Systems. They installed the upgrades which enabled China to exercise control over the web. And that's not a solitary instance, so there are lots of bad actors. History, I think, throws up a new set of questions we should deal with. The second aspect of contextual intelligence, I think, is academic disciplines. All of them need to engage with the present day. If IB was engaging with the present day, I would expect our journals to be replete with exploring the role of global business and multinationals with justice, inequality, and environmental degradation. Our journals are not replete with those topics. And I think that's a problem. And I think a third component of contextual intelligence, which affects all academic disciplines, including IB, is a recognition that the world has changed. Europe is now, 20% of world GDP. North America is 25%. Most economic activities outside those two regions. The settings and the issues need to be explored in the majority of the world, not in Western countries, I think. If we do that, we'll see all different types of worlds. We'll face, for example, businesses which flourished in conditions of turbulence, economic uncertainty, and we'll see how they were able to do that. And that raises very interesting questions. I think, too, we'll understand rather more what's happening to the world now in all sorts of ways, from ecological disaster to migration. So I think it's a moral obligation for academics to become more engaged in the world and escape from their comfortable but utterly useless, finally, settings.
Thank you. Thank you, Geoff. And finally, we turn to Victor, who has spent a considerable amount of time outside the West and brings the perspective of both perspectives. So you're our cleanup hitter here.
Thank you. I'm glad you made a provocative last sentence. I hope I can match it with something provocative of my own. Yeah, I mean, I just want to very briefly sort of perhaps lay out some background to these very interesting questions that have been raised by my colleagues, by Geoff and Will. Whether we live in the best of times or the worst of times, there's no denying, I think, that we do live in a time of extremely rapid and unsettling change. But I think we also need to step back a little bit from the daily news, including the UK election, and try to sort of assess the bigger picture. And I make no apologies for starting by stating the obvious, and something that's barely been touched on, although you did mention ecological disaster and migration right at the end, and that is the environment, and the most significant change that is the background to everything that we're undergoing is environmental and climatic. We have now definitively entered the Anthropocene age, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that we now recognize that we have entered it. So we have, the atmosphere, the oceans, the soil, once thought of as boundless in their capacity to absorb human folly and, of course, carbon dioxide pollutants and to cope with the extraction of resources. Those are reaching their limits in the sense that we are starting to notice the impact of what we are doing to our climate and to the other species that share the planet with us. Now, I'm not going to go over a lot of the things that we need to do to limit global warming and adapt to climate change. Those are very well known and much discussed, if not as much implemented as we would like. But I will just say that global population growth and the way we are reluctant to speak truthfully about demographics is extremely dangerous, both for the planet and for us. In that book that was mentioned that I wrote about the Ganges, I mentioned how India's population is in the process of increasing by around 500 million in a few decades. That is essentially the entire population of Europe today is being added to the Indian population by about 2050. So it will, in a few years, probably 5 years or so, it will become the most populous country on the planet and overtake China and have about 1.7 billion people. The world's population has increased by about 1 billion in the last 12 years and is forecast to rise to, I think, 10 billion shortly. So we have, it's a very, very major issue that people are curiously reluctant to talk about. And it does impact everything, whether it's the international balance of power or the surges of migration that you mentioned into Europe. And these are very large effects and they're very hard to calculate. But you still have economists and investment bank analysts and business leaders who talk blandly about the positive demographics of countries such as Niger and Pakistan and the negative or disastrous demographics of countries such as Japan and Norway. This is a very, very short-term view which says that the dependency ratio in these countries is rising. There are going to be more consumers in Africa. That's great. We can sell more tea bags. And it's just, I think, very risky to talk about it in those terms and not to accept the long-term implications of what we're doing. And it's a very uncomfortable issue for religious reasons, for political reasons, but it is it is an issue that we should discuss. The second important change that we confront, and of course it has an effect on the first, is the restructuring of the world order. And I'll be very brief, but principally what we're talking about is the rise of China as a superpower. I think you've written a book about China, haven't you, Will? And the disengagement of the US under Donald Trump, but also previously from coherent involvement in international affairs, the struggles of Europe to assert itself through the European Union. These are all kind of quite momentous things that have been happening in the last few decades. China under Xi Jinping no longer even pays lip service to respecting the post-war international consensus, if you like, on such matters as the rule of law, including the international rule of law, respect for self-determination, and so on. And it's very hard to talk about global business today without talking about China. Thirdly, after the global environment and international politics, we talk about national politics, and this has been briefly mentioned. We have seen a remarkable rise of a range of connected phenomena: populism, nationalism, nativism. Nativism is a characteristic of the Hong Kong uprising that a lot of people are not necessarily aware of. It's not just about democracy, it's also about a sort of Hong Kong Cantonese nativism against the mainland Chinese, which is not always pleasant, democratic, and liberal. We've also got religious intolerance in recent years, and these things are happening all around the world. It's not just England and Scotland. It is happening there, obviously, but we've also got the same phenomena happening in Catalonia, Italy, Eastern Europe, India, China, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Brazil, and so on. It really is, it's a pretty global movement. And the significance of it, or a series of movements, if you like, has, I think, largely been missed. You were talking about how, international business and business schools perhaps have sort of lost the plot. And we all have. I mean, the media has also been to blame in this. And generally, the kind of elites, the metropolitan elites of the world have not taken account of these, have not understood what is happening around us. So not enough of us saw Brexit coming because we didn't spend enough time in Felixstowe or wherever. Not enough of us saw the Gilets jaunes coming because we didn't spend enough time in Lille. Not enough people saw the Hong Kong uprising happening. Not enough people saw, the rise to power of Donald Trump, again, because the flyover states were effectively flown over. Now, if you take these three trends, environment, international politics in a nutshell, and you think about how our knowledge of them and our opinions of them are transmitted among us over social media, over the internet, through big tech companies, that brings us to the fourth and I think big, alarming thing that we need to think about, and that is essentially public discourse. The quantity of public discourse has been massively increased, democratized, if you like, in the sense that it involves more people more of the time. But the quality of public discourse has deteriorated markedly. Hate speech is rampant. I was on the receiving end of some the other day for a sort of bizarre case of mistaken identity, and it's really quite scary and quite alarming. Falsehoods are perceived as truths. Knowledge is questioned. Science and scientific evidence are seen as forms of sort of religion in which or faith, in which you can believe or not believe, rather than simply being statements of the facts. So these kind of four things are the kind of broad background to some of the issues I think we're going to talk about tonight. And just very briefly, what do we need to do? I mean, I'll start in reverse order and just throw out some very short thoughts. We need to restore the truth and reasoned debate to their rightful place in public discourse and the media. It's not easy, I know. That's the first thing. And so still working backwards, we need to fight narrow nationalisms, intolerance, and we need to do that, I guess, with more tolerance and with a sort of commitment to liberalism and certainly internationalism. Thirdly, we need to stand up for those values, not just domestically, but on the international stage, and that means not allowing authoritarian states such as China or Russia to dictate the terms of the international debate, which they are increasingly starting to do. And then lastly, to go back to the first point about the environment, we need to do what we need to do to save the planet. Thank you very much.
Grand openings from all three of you, and nicely complementary in interesting ways, and potentially in seeing different parts of the puzzle. Before we start our discussion, In terms of your asking questions, I am a dinosaur, although I spent so long at MIT, but I tell everyone I studied technology, I never actually learned how to use it. So Beth is going to handle the iPad over the airwaves questions, but the written ones I'm perfectly capable of handling, and I encourage you to submit written comments and questions. And while we're collecting those, I'm going to start with one to the panelists, which is that much of the discourse, the discussion around the problems that we're facing today is personalized. And it's often personalized in terms of leaders, that it's the fault of Trump, or he's bringing things to the table. It's the fault of various populist leaders who are arising, who are recreating the culture, enabling the change of discourse, creating divides. And I wanted to know if you have views on whether this is sort of going down a rat hole on the part of the media that is, it's not important, it's a misframing of what are much more fundamental issues. Are these leaders symptomatic of bigger and more problems, or are they genuinely contributing to the disorder that societies are facing today? And I just thought if you had any thoughts on the role of leadership in this. Anyone? And
No,
Victor, do you want to take
I think it's true, basically, that the problem is that we are focusing on the personalities, but significantly, because we're focusing on the personalities, we're not focusing on the policies.
Yes.
And this is to do with short attention spans, it's to do with social media. It's much more fun to watch a video of Boris Johnson saying something stupid or Donald Trump saying something stupid than to actually think about what policies they're actually implementing. So you had this sort of weird debate the other day about whether or not there would be border checks in the Irish Sea. I mean, I couldn't understand what it was all about. I mean, that's what the EU agreement is. Otherwise, the EU and Ireland wouldn't have agreed to it, And there was this whole thing about whether or not it was true. I mean, and everyone instead is focusing not on that, but they're focusing on, Boris Johnson and whether he's a good guy. And yeah, it's a huge problem. But I think, curiously, it doesn't always work to the benefit of those personalities. If you think about Trump, and we can all think of lots of bad things that Trump has done, but a lot of people have forgotten, a lot of people who hate Trump have forgotten that he has total bipartisan consensus on what he's doing with China, in confronting China, which is kind of curious, and nobody thinks about that. But people privately will say, yeah, actually, Obama was a bit soft on China, and Trump is doing the right thing. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that, but the point is that those policies are lost, whether you hate them or love them, in this kind of ludicrous kind of social media world that we sadly live in. And I mean, probably we should just mention business leaders, whether the age of the kind of Titanic CEO is, I mean, maybe we have gone past peak sort of madness in terms of CEO worship. I think perhaps we have, but it's still there, this idea that, we should worship and overpay these kind of people rather than think about installing policies in companies that, will ensure the durability and success of the company in the long term for all the things that it needs to do in the new capitalism, which is not just make profits, but also make society better. I sense that there is a sort of change in one sense, but not, unfortunately, in executive pay, which still remains completely out of kilter. So that's,
Jeff?
So I can do the Voice of History Act.
Yes.
I mean, I think bad leaders make situations much worse. So if you look at like Hitler, that's all the makings of something happening were there, but you got a very charismatic guy and he did that sort of thing. Trump, the racism and the nativism that you see in America, now is, you can trace it back to the 19th century.
Or earlier.
He's just, a bad leader can legitimize it and exacerbate it. But broadly, absolutely, I don't think individuals drive these things. For me, these waves occur. It's about winners and losers. And you get extremely large waves of populism and of nationalism when the numbers of losers outweigh the number of winners.
So they're symptoms rather than
I
causes.
think so. I mean, in 21st century, the number of losers is far greater than the number of winners, the way globalization has worked.
Is that true? I don't think that's true. I think that's an extraordinary state. I think that's just a sign of how everyone is incredibly pessimistic about the world. You think that, 2/3 of China has been taken out of poverty in the last 50 years. And even in Europe, people are very prosperous and actually should be very happy. They're not happy, but it's not because they're not as comfortable or prosperous as they were. I mean, our children are, 2.5 times as rich as we were on a per capita basis as children, I think, roughly. The world is not a bad place to live in the West or in China or in the developing world compared to what it was like before.
Half of
but
India,
the perception is of negativism and sort of despair, and it's all going wrong. Right?
Half of India doesn't have a toilet. There's absolute levels of poverty throughout Africa beyond words.
I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that it's getting better.
And I think
not worse.
A moderator shouldn't jump in here, but the sociologists, when they're trying to construct theories of social change, said that you actually don't necessarily get revolutions when people are miserable. You get it when things have been getting better and then they get worse.
That's what I was told about France, actually.
Yes.
Exactly that. That's right. Yeah, it's because the economy is doing okay,
and then
everybody wants a bigger share of the pie.
Or it's
that's
doing
how
okay, and
happen,
then there's setbacks, or there's maldistribution or something. So but and I think we might be in a period now where the benefits aren't flowing.
Yeah, there was some philosopher who said something like, France is a paradise for people who think they live in hell, which is very appropriate for the current situation. It was quoted by one of my colleagues, not by me.
The Gini coefficient is much better than in Britain or than the US.
Yeah.
It doesn't, and the social structure is also much better, but it absolutely hasn't stopped populism.
Yes, I'm not sure that it's worse now in terms of pointing to individual leaders than 30, 40, 50 years ago. I do think it matters what the character and predispositions are of the man or woman who holds high office, be it in a company or in politics. And I think there's some evidence that in politics the gene pool has got poorer over the last 30, 40 years. But I'm not certain that I would actually point my finger at that as what's wrong systemically now. I think that I think what's wrong systemically now is some combination of actually perhaps what Geoff and I were trying to say. That actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, Geoff, what Philippon has to say about American capitalism shouldn't be a surprise, actually, but is a surprise. We have there's been a
because the airwaves have been dominated by what American thinking about how business is supposed to work.
I think too much permission has been given to a particular kind of way of thinking about how markets and business work, which have absolutely allowed the system to go rogue. And actually, the corrective mechanisms, checks and balances in our democracy, checks and balances within firms, actually checks and balances within corporate governance have all failed or not worked as they should. And consequently, there's been a revolt from below. That's how I would kind of semi-understand what's been happening. And I'm not sure I put my finger at that leader being kind of inadequate or there being too much focus on leadership as being the cause of it.
Yeah. The lobbying power of Facebook and Google is truly astounding.
Yes.
And Exxon as well, obviously. But you just see this extraordinary ability to kind of change American policy. Perhaps it's more kind of transparent under Trump because he's a bit of
egregious.
He's a bit of an idiot, and it's so egregious. But he will literally sort of change, turn on a dime because Facebook or Google or whoever he does like at the moment has told him to. We should guess.
Here's one from
Mark. So, should we be challenging the idea that growth is good in the context of the climate emergency and refocus on problems of inequality and distribution of what exists rather than this fixation on growth? Is a fixation on growth part of the pathology of capitalism that you were talking about?
Look, this will be contentious, but I don't actually see a tension between growth and the environment. I do see a tension in the way we have grown. But it is perfectly possible to construct kind of a world in which we kind of curate nature and create the biome better than we currently do and still grow. And I don't see it as I don't think that we can be water conservation, species diversity, the capacity to. I don't know what's happening at Leeds University, but or I guess what's happening in my college. We're aiming by 2030 to have zero carbon emissions. We're aiming actually to becoming. A number of colleges are already some of the way to it, but Oxford hopes by 2030 that actually to have kind of to be kind of utterly sustainable on all metrics. Now we may not get there, but I think there'll be as many students or as more students going through the university in 2030 than there are now. I don't think those two things are inconsistent. So I don't accept the premise of the question. Actually, to say three more sentences, I actually think, I go further, I actually think that the great technologies that are coming down towards us will enable us to sustain kind of reasonable quality of life on Earth sustainably. And I really don't, I think it doesn't help the cause to actually pose the question in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I slightly disagree, but only in the sense that it's clear that sort of, the push for growth based on consumption is kind of insane, and it's still insane. We had, there was a kind of anti-Black Friday movement in France, and I thought, maybe that will make a difference. It didn't make a difference. Sales went up. So there is a sort of weird. This morning going to Brussels Airport, I was handed a packet of biscuits. God knows, I think I've still got it in my pocket actually. But I remember sort of thinking, I don't actually want these biscuits, but I'm taking them because I'm being offered something to consume biscuits. And of course it's in a plastic wrapper. And I sort of thought of going back to the people and saying, what's going to happen to these wrappers? And I thought that would be a bit, but there is a kind of mad consumption that goes on, which we are not only not stopping on our own behalf, but we're, in the developed world, but we're also sort of pushing that model to other countries, and India in particular, and China already. China's already a high-consuming country, and you just sort of think, does it make sense? And yes, it produces economic growth, but does it increase the quality of life? And I think probably the answer is no. So I think there is a problem. I'm
not sure that. Again, there was some agreement between us here. It's not necessarily kind of material goods that you need to kind of carry on your consumption of.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think consumption is migrating to the experiential, to the intellectual, to the aesthetic, and all those domains. And there are ways in which that, actually they tend to be kind of less resource expensive than material goods. I don't think that, I do accept that having kind of lots of plastic and et cetera, is not necessary. So
but
I'm
it's
completely
soluble, right?
with you.
It's soluble, yeah.
But the way people will live in 10, 20, or 30 years' time will be, I think, it will be richer than the way we currently live, not necessarily in material terms, but in experiential terms. And actually that can happen to many hundreds of millions of more people without us having to say, let's not grow.
And that's what, Jeff, you were saying that,
Jeff,
weren't you? You were saying that that sort of visible trade was falling, but services trade, which is exactly these kind of experiential things that Will was talking about, are actually on the rise. So maybe it's true. Maybe we can all...
I do think we need a reduction. Present-day consumerism is, I personally think, is highly destructive for the environment. I had an interesting conversation with the head of Unilever Sustainability 2 years ago. He came to consult me on how he could reduce water consumption, which is a great ideal. And I said, well, the best way you could do it is...
Sell less stuff.
Sell less stuff. And then he looked at me and he said, you know, I do the water side, and my friend over there does the marketing side. So I took from that Unilever is a company which is making all the problems, and then they're doing better than most companies to try and do something about that. And I think that's really, it's something people from J.K. Galbraith in the 1950s were writing about, that we actually need a change in consumption
But it's
habits.
already happening. I mean, it's already happening. I mean, investment in intangibles, that's to say, you know, computer algorithms, kind of the experiential, the investment in that surpassed the investment in tangibles in 2000. And actually, now the run rate is 50% higher. I mean, already, you know, the economic base has kind of transformed itself. And actually, that's part of the problem, is that actually that's been taking place in metropolitan centres like London and Leeds, and not in the places that actually have been throwing up these problematic votes across Western democracies.
Well, manufacturing industry places, for example, yeah. That's a fair point.
And in terms of this decline of places, and another question that's asked, and it was directed to you, Will, but I think all the panelists might want to weigh in on this. The spatial inequality is caused often by the decline of regionally concentrated industry, and some of it is due, it's commonly blamed on globalization, but much of it is due to technological change.
Yes.
To those industries being supplanted or phased out.
Yes.
And the idea that only to get the jobs back, you just have to raise trade barriers, which is a fallacy if, in fact, it's technological change.
Well, I mean, I think this is...
How do you address that?
It's such a good question. And actually, we're going to, all three of us, have a stab at answering it. But we won't get very far because it's so bloody difficult. But it's... I think that there are kind of two or three ways to answer this. First of all, I think that, picking up on my point about the experiential, I think the growth of jobs over the next kind of generation will be interpersonal. It'll be the growth of mentoring, coaching, teaching, care, all of that will be outdoor activities where you have coaches. One of the kind of boom kind of areas in education at the moment is actually kind of training in outdoors, outdoor fitness and outdoor leadership. That's where the growth will come. And actually what you have to do is to have the connectivity kind of with ultra cheap transport and ultra cheap housing to allow people to pursue those occupations kind of within kind of close to the hotspots, which will be these metropolitan urban areas that I've described. That's one way of kind of dealing with it. But I mean, we ain't going to bring manufacturing and mining back to Blythe Valley. We're not going to make the Tyne a great shipbuilding area. It's just not going to happen. And actually, I don't know how you develop great policy that actually, honest to God, addresses it. And then the next step is how you get politicians and build political parties that convince the people at the receiving end of this that they should buy into this vision, such as it is. I mean, it is the $64,000 question kind of in contemporary politics, in my view, and economics.
Mm-hmm. Victor?
I would just say it is a problem, and it is soluble. I'm looking at the example of France, where there's massive unemployment in France compared to other Western European countries, including the UK, and compared to Germany, and it's always been a bit of a mystery. If you look at the numbers, it's really bizarre. I mean, it's not just the French employment and unemployment systems which is at fault. There are also spatial inequalities, if you like. So there are actually hundreds of thousands of jobs available. Employers are screaming for employees. They cannot get them. But it is in certain places and it is in certain skills. So you have areas where, there are no jobs and there are unemployed people, and then you have skills or technologies where there are lots of jobs and nobody to fill them. You have a sort of fundamental problem there. Now, it is not insoluble. You can have, it's not just a matter of getting on your bike, to go for the job. There's a lot of, the French government is investing $15 billion in training and so on, so there are sort of ways of going around this. And of course, the other way to fill the jobs is to have immigration, or to have migration, which is the way, in fact, that it is filled largely in France. But, if you can't get a technician in, you fill them from Portugal, because the person
I'm
can
very
travel.
struck by two examples, actually quite interesting, which some of the people in the audience may know. I'm very struck by the way the university and Philips in Holland have used Eindhoven as a growth pole to really create, to kind of lean against these trends. And also, in Britain, Lincoln University, which became a university quite recently, then went deliberately kind of to attract, build its engineering and vocational training, and actually attracted Siemens into Lincoln. And actually, that again has kind of lent against the kind of deindustrialization and de-agriculturalization, which is another phenomenon, by the way, that was taking place in kind of Lincolnshire. But, so it can be done, but it does require actually a new and enhanced role, which academics may find difficult for the university. Because the universities and actually become kind of central parts of industrial policy in a knowledge economy. And Lincoln University or Eindhoven would be impossible without the role of the higher education institutions. Similarly, one of the reasons why Leeds is so vibrant is because of this university, actually. And of course, if you're an academic, trying to get published, as you were describing, this isn't actually part of your kind of career or vision.
Yeah, we do. Sorry.
No, I just think that the growth of giant global corporations is a problem because it's separated decision-making from place.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a real issue. Like if you think of the great paternalists, whatever, in the 19th century America or Europe, they were located in a place that did all the infrastructure. Now they sit somewhere. Most of their money is going through the BVI or Cayman Islands or something, and they have limited attachment to place. Clearly Philips does with Eindhoven, but Philips operates all over the rest, many other places, and it's probably not doing that in any other location. It's chosen its home base, and I think that is an issue which needs addressing some way.
And it is an issue that IB has not taken on about whether or not the cosmopolitans that we are trying to develop as people who can move effortlessly across locations are not really just people who can move effortlessly across metropolitan locations, but are not linked in any sense to the locations beyond the metropolis, which looks alike.
It's very. One of the reasons why you get these vicious circle effects in these inverted commas left behind communities all over Western democracies is because actually being a doctor or being a young professional, in some of these places, you don't meet people like you. You try and form a book club in the parts of Blackpool, and there's just no one like you, and you don't want to live in them. You're not likely to meet someone you might want to marry. And all of that. And these places find themselves in just downward vortexes, and try to get a kind of the complicated nexus of policies to help these places get back on their feet and be attractive to kind of live and work in is really, really, really hard and requires honest to God kind of confronting why some people don't want to be there.
Beth, do we have some more questions coming in? Go ahead, just read it off from the lectern.
Oh, no, it moved. Okay. From Happy, which I hope reflects how you're feeling. Regarding the economics of happiness, do you believe that we should follow a degrowth economic paradigm?
Economics of happiness.
My great friend, Professor Richard Layard, is producing a book in January on precisely the subject. And Richard would argue that the single most important cause of unhappiness is mental health issues. And he would decouple the question from growth. It isn't economic growth that causes kind of mental ill health, depression, panic attacks, and the whole damn nexus. It is, and here we get into kind of, it gets really civilizational. I don't know, and beyond maybe the remit of this conference, but I mean, you have to start discussing, why it is that so many individuals are kind of unable to come to terms with modern life. What is it about the kind of stress, the comparabilities, the need to be perfect, the kind of multiple reasons why people get depressed or feel kind of dissatisfied with their lot? I don't have ready answers, but what I will say, is that you have to work quite hard to link the growth of mental ill health to growth per se. Maybe to consumption, you can make an effort.
Yeah, well, I was going to say employment, because there's a big debate in France at the moment about pension reform, and I was just reading a magazine article today, and it's not causation, I guess, but there's a very high correlation between working longer and being happy. Between countries. Yes. And so the French retire earliest, and they're the most gloomy, of the kind of set of countries. I think the other gloomies the French think they want to retire early, but actually it's not making them happy. I know, as I said, it's hard to draw direct lines of causation, but the fact is that countries where people work longer actually tend to have happier people. So in a sense, the French sort of push for earlier retirement ages, or trying to keep early retirement ages, is actually not making them happier. So, in a sense, so I would say, in a way, the issue of happiness is not so much about growth, and we all know about Bhutan, and, Bhutan having gross national happiness instead of gross national product, but it's just about whether you have a productive life rather than whether, your economy is growing. I think the mental health is what it comes down to, in the sense that if you feel you're doing something worthwhile and you enjoy it, you're likely to be happy. Whereas if you are out of work, for example, or whatever, then you're not. It's really about, it's not about the size of the economy, or even necessarily, and we all know this, it's not about the size of your personal income. It's about whether your life is valuable in the sense of you feel you've got something valuable to do, rather than whether you're earning more money.
My Aristotelian question I posed.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Yeah.
Jeff, do you have any?
Not many universities I know prioritize the happiness of their staff, which would be quite a good start.
It would be a good start.
As we're teaching the next generation of people, actually, and you see such unhappy people.
Yeah.
Actually, I think there's a lot of evidence that people doing PhDs have more mental health difficulties than their peers. It's lonely.
Is that because they're nerdy?
I think it's actually about social contact and loneliness and that kind of stuff like that. People can reflect on that over a drink, but certainly the studies I've seen are that, against a control group, if you want a group of unhappy people, you'll find them doing PhDs.
And it raises the question of home working, whether that makes people happier or not. I don't know the answer.
They're less unhappy. They're less happy. They're less happy. Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the interesting issues is this idea of community. And there was a great wave of optimism about the new technologies, which would create virtual community, so that you actually didn't have to be physically in the same location as someone to develop relationships. And one of the interesting things that Sherry Turkle at MIT is studying about her book Reclaiming Conversation is about what kind of conversations do you have virtually and what do you not have virtually. And what she finds is that virtual conversations tend not to develop empathy, because when they get uncomfortable, people disconnect. And you're not actually forced to deal often with the
and one of the problems.
I'm sure that's right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
What's it called? Reframing.
It's called Reclaiming Conversation. She's done a lot of studies about how younger people use technology, and she is extremely worried about the fact that young people will break up over their phones through texting, because it's just easier that way.
Yeah.
And if you do that, there are certain things that you just don't learn about interacting with people.
Yeah.
And this casts rather a different light on all our earlier optimism about how the new technologies would create social communities.
Well, I think so. In other words, it's not just the quality of public discourse, it's the quality of private discourse
Yes,
that has
exactly.
also gone down. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. I
And
think
they
that's
may
true.
not be unrelated.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things I find slightly alarming is that, is this kind of mood of kind of hate. We've seen it in the UK, or with our UK friends. We've seen it in America, and even though we're in this bubble, I mean, obviously, I suppose it's inevitable that I would tend to be. Most of my friends on Facebook would tend to be anti-Trump, and most of them would tend to be anti-Brexit.
Yeah.
That's the kind of bubble we live in. Only 2 or 3 are not. But even in my sort of self-selected bubble group, I detect unpleasant things where people are getting nastier in their conversations
Interesting.
with other people. Not with me, but
Yeah.
with the people they don't disagree with. And I find it slightly disturbing. And it is
Yes.
to do with the way social media has kind of dominated the way we run our conversations.
It's not so much social media, it's just, the way one has kind of, the way one connects digitally. I mean, I'm nothing social about it, I'm just direct email to email. I mean, I find that, a level of toxicity in emails can just be, Anyway.
But when you
Yes.
engage someone in a conversation,
Yeah.
directly, even if it's over the, then suddenly the temperature, the tensions reduce, and if you actually have a one-on-one discussion with somebody, suddenly everything calms down because people realize they're talking to another human being.
Yeah.
But it's quite hard to get to that point
Yeah.
in the sort of torrent of abuse that you tend to get, especially if you're
In
a
the
public
media.
person or you're in the media or whatever.
Yeah.
You're just dealing with sort of torrents of abuse and whatever. It's difficult.
Jeff, any thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. Advances in communications technology seem to be accompanied by increased surge of nationalism and populism, hatred of the other. So if you think of the advent of cinema in the first part of the 21st
interesting.
century, what do you get? You get fascism, it was hatred. The more people saw of each other, the more they hated each other. And it looks like we're having a rerun of that.
Interesting.
We've never been so communicated, but people are like really upset, or they're jealous, or they think they're not winners instead of they see winners. Something about
So
that.
the promise of social media was exactly wrong and
Yeah.
was
It
the
looks-
opposite. Yeah.
It looks like
to be.
it.
Beth, do you have another question for
I
us?
do. 3.
3 questions.
Well done, guys. Actually, we'll combine 2 of them. So for something completely different now, if interdisciplinary research is kind of the kiss of death for an academic career and promotion and all that good stuff, then should we be embracing it or not? And if so, how? What changes are needed at all levels? Thinking structural, cognitive. And then as a rejoinder to that from Mark, do we need different kinds of journals, and does the push for open access provide an opportunity? Told you it's different.
I leave that to my academic colleagues, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, it's you.
Do you want to tackle that?
I mean, I think I think most people think advances in knowledges are probably going to come now from disciplines interacting, and not just cognate disciplines, but quite different disciplines like natural sciences and social sciences. I mean, we have all these problems in academia. We have like department chairs and journal editors, and they all tend to block things rather than facilitate them. And I think journal editors, for example, have to be prepared to take risks, to overrule conservative referees and push agendas on a little bit. And department chairs have got to be prepared if they see somebody doing something really novel and innovative to go with them and push them. So that's a responsibility for the more senior people in the profession to get a grip, because junior people are too vulnerable and the penalties are too great for stepping out of line. So the people who are like too old, who have already ruined their careers, have just got to do it, I think.
But you know what, that puts me in mind of, you've probably all read it, but Udo Zander and Bruce Kogut's reflection on the publication, the long ordeal they went through to get their seminal piece published on the knowledge and the multinational, and that they got these long reviews trashing everything about their paper, tackling the fundamental assumptions, saying they'd misrepresented the existing theory, all of this stuff. And they tried to sort of address that, and it never quite worked. And finally they said to the editor, don't you think that a paper that arouses this much passion and emotion and debate is worth publishing? And I think perhaps editors should look more for bimodal reviews. If you get a paper that's reviewed and some people really like it and one of your editors hates it, don't persuade them to homogenize it to make the editor, the reviewer that hates it, love it.
Actually, one thing about this, just to pick up on the interdisciplinary, that it isn't, it's absolutely clear that that's where all the great kind of substantive innovations in the next kind of period ahead are going to come from. I mean, it's the crossovers between disciplines, and there's some quite good work by the Royal Society just showing that's already been the case and will be acceleratingly the case. You know, and one of the points about kind of the digital revolution is that kind of data crosses disciplines. Data is kind of totally fungible. It moves from kind of, you know, it can move from chemistry to zoology to physics like that. And so, you know, because that's where the action's going to be, you know, either we have to have some enterprising publisher creating new journals that actually only set about kind of publishing such papers, kind of, or it will become clear that if you don't do what you're describing, that you'll be a loser. Mm-hmm. And there may be, I mean, it may be smart if you're a 25 to 30-year-old academic to think, you know, because that's the way the wind is blowing, let's actually, you know, burrow in this territory. Let's publish in this territory.
If you don't have interdisciplinary research, you fall into the trap set by, you know, the tech companies. One of the problems with information is that it tends to be, we know we can physically, technologically channel it, you know, so people get news feeds on the subjects that they want or they think they want. So they don't get, you know, it's like the difference between an old-fashioned newspaper. You'd open the newspaper and you'd think, blimey, that's interesting. I didn't know I needed to know that. But actually, even though I work in physics, you know, this thing that's happening in biology or that's happening in politics is really interesting and really important for my work. And that has kind of gone to some extent. Certainly the way we look at the media, and that probably applies to academic media as well.
I think that's right.
And, you know, you have this kind of problem of everything being funneled and nobody having the advantage of serendipitous, oh, that's interesting. You know, today there was an article I read by our science correspondent amid all the maelstrom about how the magnetic north is surging around at 50 kilometers a year, which is extraordinary, you know, and nobody quite knows what's happening with the Earth's magnetic field. This is really important for physicists and for navigators and for airlines and for all kinds of other people.
Controllers.
Yeah, and, you know, and yet nobody kind of, you know, and you wouldn't find it if you just had a feed on the British election or you just had a feed on biology, you wouldn't get that. You know, I saw it because it was on our homepage.
But the question on open access, and I do think that's that may be that's also a route to go down. I mean, the only problem with open access, and I'm strongly in favour of it, is that, you know, what's free isn't valued, and you kind of, you know, I don't know whether people kind of use open access sites as much as they should and could. However, I mean,
to academic papers.
Yeah. However, I mean, I can lean to it and see the attraction of it.
Well, there's currently this vicious circle called impact factors. Impact factors impacting people's careers, impacting funding decisions. So it's a kind of a recipe for intellectual stagnation.
Yes.
Really, and that's
normal science.
That's a problem, and that's a problem which, I mean, academics need to get a grip of.
And I think there's another piece to the puzzle, and interdisciplinary research. I was on a panel at Stockholm School of Economics on this just a few years ago, and they talked about there being two kinds of interdisciplinary research, and we often confuse them. One is bringing people from different disciplines together to look at a phenomenon from different viewpoints. And the other is the individual scholar who reads something in a related field and thinks, good heavens, that could actually apply to understanding phenomena in my field. I'm thinking of Robert Schiller's latest book on narrative economics, in which, from a point of view of a sociologist, it's the economist discovers social construction, which has been a dominant paradigm in sociology for the last 2 decades. But I shouldn't be contemptuous of that. I should applaud that, because that's a discipline taking into it its own perspective, something from outside the discipline. But your point that you were making about the importance of contextualization, that it's not interdisciplinary for the sake of being interdisciplinary, it's being interdisciplinary for the sake of understanding really complex phenomena that are challenging for us, don't you think?
And the challenge, I think, is to remain vigorous
Yes.
and rigorous.
Yes.
Because you just don't want to be like an amateur of whatever,
Yes,
political scientist
absolutely.
or sociologist or something. Because that's a journey to nowhere.
That's our job.
I wasn't going to say
That's our
that.
job in the media, yeah.
But relevance and rigor together and openness, I think.
Very good point. Very good point. Beth, they're getting in, conferring. Yes. Do you think we need to
Yeah, probably think about.
wrapping it up? Yes. So would our panelists like to have any reflections of perhaps even something that you might be taking away from this discussion, or some issue that didn't get raised that you wish had been raised, or any kind of final thought?
I don't know. Great minds think alike.
No, I thought we were wonderfully complimentary, actually.
You were. It was. You were absolutely marvelous.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some hanging chads in this conversation.
Yes.
I
love the metaphor.
which haven't really been opened up. I mean, I was struck by from the audience that there were a number of questions about, growth, sustainability, growth, happiness. Are those incompatible values? And one is I kind of wanted to kind of really try and land in a way that I'm not sure I did in my opening 10 minutes, was, and it picks up on your point, Geoff. I do think that, and it picks up on what the FT has been campaigning on under Lionel Barber's final weeks as editor. Interesting, I don't know whether the new editor would actually have the self-confidence to do it, to actually campaign to a business audience that they should take purpose seriously. But actually, it is potentially a kind of absolutely kind of radical way of kind of rethinking what business school curricula should be, what kind of a new area for kind of really some serious evidential research to kind of make these points. Is it true that companies that incorporate around a declared purpose from which they are going to make profit outperform a control group of those that don't? Now, actually, I want to believe that. There's lots of circumstantial evidence, but actually, stripping out what's correlation and not, actually doing it rigorously, amazingly, hasn't happened. Mm-hmm. And on the personal company, we've done the best we can from looking at kind of evidence from not only from the United States and Europe, but also India and kind of Asia, and we've got some way to try to prove it, but it sits there as a kind of hanging chad. Mm. Yeah. And what is the ecosystem which would, in terms of shareholder structure, incentive patterns, how it would mesh in with the way the investment management world is structured? I mean, contemporary capitalism, as it sits there with a monumental $10, $20 trillion asset management industry, which prizes liquidity, how does that lock into kind of this kind of world that the Financial Times and Will Hutton and a lot of good people in business want to drive towards? How's it going to happen? What's the evidence base that will prove it to those who are unconvinced? and what's the institutional structure in which it all could be housed. And for me, alongside issues of mental health, alongside issues of spatial inequality and where the jobs of the future are going to come, that is a kind of, big kind of, elephant in the room that I would love kind of financial business academics to really address.
Can I just very briefly back that up?
Yeah.
That's really all I've got to say. I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think, in a way, it's incumbent on all of us, whether you're a business school or a financial journalist, to analyze this material and to say how much of what companies are saying about the environment is greenwashing, how much is ethical pretense rather than actual changes to the way they do business, because companies have taken the message on board and they are talking about it, and the question, which we can't really judge, and it's very hard to judge, but is our job in a way to investigate, is are they actually doing it, or how much are they actually doing it?
Exactly. How can journalists, how can stakeholders, how can citizens, how can employees...
And researchers,
researchers compare one company with another. Well, I mean, we just haven't got basis for comparison. The whole thing is, and you think of the intellectual effort that is deployed on kind of trying to get published in XYZ journal, to not add much value.
But the message is definitely the message is definitely getting out there. I was just very struck by something the Vice Chancellor said right at the beginning. He was talking about Leeds, and he had this wonderful phrase to describe Leeds. He said it was a financially vibrant and compassionate city.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really kind of
interesting
juxtaposition, because he's saying, we're about business, but we're also about the other things, which is the new capitalism that Will has been talking about. So I thought, the message is there. The question is, when is the reality there, and can we judge it to be there?
Jeff, just very quickly before Tim closes.
I think there's a generational change. If I look at my skewed sample of Harvard MBAs, this last semester, somebody actually mentioned shareholder value in my class, and everybody burst out laughing. And all the questions, all the discussions were about ethics, were about the environment, about social justice. Did people agree on the answer? No. Were those the questions they're interested in? Yes. And I think a business school faculty have got to catch up with the new generation of students and where they're heading.
Very good point. And a nice note on which to end. Yeah. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. So join me in thanking them. In some sense, it reminds me of something I tell my students, and that is you will know less at the end of this class than you did at the beginning, because you won't know all the questions you should have been asking in the first place. Exactly. With that, I'd like to end the opening plenary of the conference, giving us a lot of food for thought, and to quote the recently re-elected Prime Minister, let's get EIBA done. So everybody, thank you, and there will, in fact, be drinks, and you can do all of that personal social networking rather than doing it via electronic means done in the Parkinson Court. So thank you very much, and thank the panel.